In 2013, Dr. Ana Gonzalez Angulo was at the forefront of curing breast cancer.
You won't find someone smarter than her.
Unless perhaps it was her equally gifted research partner, Dr. George Blumenschein.
Their research was really groundbreaking.
But then George fell suddenly, deathly ill.
His kidneys are failing.
And the search for the cause,
Nobody can figure out what's wrong with him.
He was a medical mystery.
would end in a shocking revelation.
We got a poisoning here.
The result was a scandal that rocked one of America's foremost research hospitals.
They ended up staying in a hotel together.
Have oral sex.
A fairly torrid love affair.
And the investigation would leave the authorities wondering, what happens when love turns malignant?
The defendant had a fatal attraction.
Houston, Texas, January 27, 2013. It was almost midnight when Dr. George Blumenschein stumbled into the emergency center of the world-renowned MD Anderson Cancer Center.
They deal with cancer patients that are having severe symptoms or trouble with their treatment.
Dr. Blumenschein treated a tremendous amount of people and was starting to do a lot of very productive research.
However, it wasn't research or a patient that brought Dr. Blumenschein to the hospital that night. The 48-year-old research scientist had become suddenly, strangely ill.
He's slurring his words, he's discombobulated, he looked like a drunk person.
However, Dr. Blumenschein wasn't drunk, according to the two women who brought him in. His girlfriend, Dr. Yvette Tony, and his research partner, Dr. Ana Gonzalez Angulo.
Anna says, I've been with him all day. All he had was coffee.
Which is why Yvette and Anna had brought him to the ER.
They believe that he may have been having a stroke.
Although, despite his odd symptoms, the two women said it had been hard to convince George that he even needed medical attention.
He was acting unreasonable, which was totally unlike him.
And even at the hospital, it took some arguing to get him inside the ER.
He was sitting on the bench outside the emergency room, trying to tell everyone he's okay, he's fine.
But eventually he relented and allowed the doctors to look him over.
There was this understandable mad dash to try to figure out what was wrong with him.
They'd run every test imaginable. They'd do a spinal tap, an MRI.
They're trying to rule out all these different things.
It wasn't a stroke or a heart attack. In fact, every test they ran came back clean.
Nobody can figure out what's wrong with him.
The physicians were basically in the dark. He was a medical mystery.
All the doctors knew for certain was that George was running out of time.
His kidneys are truly failing.
He's just getting worse and worse.
Luckily, some of the world's best doctors were on the case.
Houston is lucky because we have an incredibly robust medical community.
Including the two women who'd brought him in, Yvette and Anna.
They were there by his bedside.
And by the time their wait was over, George's mystery illness wouldn't just be a riddle for his doctors. It would be a matter for the police. Born in 1971, Ana Gonzalez Angulo grew up in Colombia, a member of one of the country's most prominent families.
She has an uncle who's a governor of one of the provinces there. They're a well-known, connected family.
But as Anna learned at a young age, no amount of wealth and privilege can completely insulate you from tragedy.
She had lost a relative, a close relative, to breast cancer.
And for Anna, the devastating loss turned out to be life-changing.
She decided at a fairly young age to pursue being a doctor.
A gifted student and tireless worker, she had the talent and dedication to meet her goal, too.
You won't find someone smarter than her.
She was first in her class, one of the brightest folks in the school.
Anna got her MD in Colombia, and then in her late 20s, she immigrated to America.
She was naturalized a U.S. citizen.
She actually finished her PhD here in Houston.
And in 2003, the 32-year-old PhD joined the staff at MD Anderson, part of Houston's sprawling Texas Medical Center.
The medical center in Houston is world-renowned.
Patients from all across the world become the MD Anderson for treatment because it's considered one of the best in the world.
They were at the forefront of curing cancer.
Although even in such stellar company, Anna stood out.
She probably is the smartest person in the room at any given time.
She was incredibly hardworking, incredibly productive, incredibly bright.
She had a passion for breast cancer research.
Equally important, the dedicated physician had a personal touch.
She wasn't some cold doctor in a white lab coat that came in and walked out. She was somebody that connected with these women on a very, very personal level.
Anna's tireless devotion left the 30-something researcher little time for a personal life, though.
She has no children. She's not married.
Instead, Anna's closest relationships were with her colleagues, people like Dr. George Blumenshine. 6 years older than Anna, George's resume was every bit as impressive as hers.
He studied head and neck cancers. He went to the best schools. He was well known for his work.
By all accounts, he was a well-respected physician who was at the top of his field.
He and Anna first met in 2008 when she was 37.
They had overlapping patients, which then led to overlapping research.
They were interested in drug development.
And by 2011, their mutual patients and mutual interests had led both doctors to reach the same conclusion.
They said, hey, let's work together.
Started researching together the interplay between breast cancer and head and neck cancers and treatments that would be beneficial for both.
George certainly had every reason to want to work with such a gifted researcher.
She enjoyed an incredible reputation, one of the brightest and best breast cancer oncologists in the world.
She truly was someone on whom a number of people had pinned their hopes for advancements in the treatment and cure of cancer.
And for Anna, George had expertise she lacked.
His involvement is basically clinical trials.
Dr. Blumenshine and Dr. Gonzalez made a really good team.
And as the months passed, the team spent long hours in the lab together.
Both during the week and on weekends.
Going to a lot of dinners, a lot of meetings together.
They would publish research together.
And as interest in that research grew, they were often invited to speak at conferences around the world.
Vietnam, Dubai, they traveled sometimes 3-4 days out of the week.
Obviously, the research partners became close.
She considered him a close personal friend and colleague.
Anna had also become close to George's long-term girlfriend, Dr. Yvette Toney. Yvette first met George in the late 90s, and for a time they worked together at MD Anderson.
She's a PhD, she's an epidemiologist.
It wasn't long after that they had begun dating.
Dr. Toney is a beautiful, incredible, self-made woman.
She put herself through school. She worked really hard.
By 2011, Yvette had long since left MD Anderson for a job in pharmaceutical research, but she was still dating George after 14 years.
Dr. Blumenshine was this almost commitment phobe. You know, she wanted to get married. He wasn't sure he wanted to get married.
However, that same year, the couple had taken a huge step towards commitment.
He and Yvette Toney were planning on having a child.
Although considering they were both in their late 40s, having a child may have been an even bigger commitment than they expected.
They had gone to several doctors to look at in vitro fertilization and were working very hard and spending a lot of money to try and have a baby.
And in September of 2012, when George confided in his research partner about their troubles conceiving, Anna did her best to be supportive.
Anna was a friend, someone who cared about them as a couple.
But the work came first.
Their research was really groundbreaking.
And thanks in part to George's able assistance, it appeared that Anna was on the verge of the sort of success that she had been chasing her entire life.
She was in the process of making major breakthroughs in cancer research.
But late on the evening of January 27, 2013, Anna would have an entirely different sort of medical mystery on her hands. Her research partner was dying, and no one could figure out why. By sunrise on January 28, 2013, it had been 7 hours since Anna Gonzalez Angulo and Yvette Toney had rushed George Blumenshine into the emergency center of Houston's MD Anderson Cancer Center, suffering from strange symptoms.
He wasn't acting right, he was confused, his speech was slurred.
Anna and George were colleagues, cancer researchers at the hospital.
These doctors are world-renowned. They're some of the best in their field.
Dr. Blumenshine's girlfriend, Yvette, was also a doctor and a pharmaceutical researcher.
She worked for a brief time at MD Anderson.
Now she was there watching her boyfriend slowly slip away.
His kidney function was plummeting. His body was in severe distress.
And the doctors had no idea what was causing it.
They're running out all kinds of tests, every test under the sun you could possibly imagine.
You think stroke, heart attack, something maybe congenital.
All the usual tests came back negative, though.
This was a mystery diagnosis.
But then, on January 31st, after almost 4 days in the ICU, a breakthrough.
The kidney specialist comes in and realizes there's a cloud in George Blumenshine's urine, and he takes a sample from that, puts it under the microscope, and is floored by what he sees.
His urine, it had crystals in it.
And those crystals could only indicate one thing: ethylene glycol.
Ethylene glycol is the main ingredient in antifreeze.
The people from the emergency room said, we got a problem, we got a poisoning here.
At least that's what the doctors assumed.
He didn't ingest this on purpose. Someone had to give it to him.
But who would want to poison one of the most prominent cancer researchers in the world? After placing George on dialysis in a desperate attempt to restore kidney function, the emergency room staff contacted the authorities, and an investigator tried to get a statement from the doctor.
I did what was probably a 5-minute interview because of the amount of pain that he was in.
So with the doctor in no real condition to speak, the investigators turned to the closest thing to next of kin, George's girlfriend of nearly 16 years, Dr. Yvette Toney.
Yvette described the night prior to him being hospitalized and the events that occurred.
Yvette told the investigators that George had recently been out of town at a medical conference.
George had been in San Diego on Friday, had come home on Saturday, had picked up some food, brought it home.
They each had their own separate dish, but they shared the glass of wine.
He goes to sleep, he feels fine.
And according to Yvette, George had felt fine the next morning, too. She said he'd gotten up early and gone into the hospital to finish up some work with Anna.
The plan was to work that Sunday morning and catch up on all his dictation and notes on his patient files and do some research.
But Yvette told police that George had called her partway through the day, and she said that she could immediately tell that something wasn't right.
He had slurred speech, he was confused.
He starts telling Yvette, I think something's wrong, I don't know what's wrong with me.
Knowing that the cancer researcher was not the type to exaggerate, Yvette said she had told George to go to the emergency room.
Tells him, go get checked out right now.
And when she didn't hear back from him for a while, Yvette said she had assumed that George had taken her advice.
He was in the hands of his colleagues, all trained medical professionals. If something was really that wrong with him, somebody would figure it out and get him to where he needed to be.
However, according to Yvette, when she still hadn't heard from George by late that evening, she started to worry and started making calls.
Trying to track him down, trying to figure out what's going on.
Trying to get a hold of him, she can't.
Yvette said that finally, at a little before 10 o'clock, she had called Anna.
She calls Dr. Gonzalez and says, where is George?
Anna's answer, George was at her house.
Dr. Blumenshine, like any other doctor, doesn't like to go to the doctor, so he doesn't. He ignores Yvette Toney's advice and goes to Anna's house.
Yvette said she'd rushed straight to Anna's, exasperated at George's stubbornness.
She says, stay right there. I'm going to come get him. I'm taking him to the hospital.
But Yvette told police that by the time she'd gotten to Anna's, George was gone.
He wrestled his keys away from her, got in his car, and left.
He's on his way to MD Anderson.
Terrified, Yvette said she and Anna had rushed to the cancer center, where they found George milling around aimlessly outside the building.
He looks drunk. He looks like stumbling drunk.
He could have killed someone or killed himself, driving in that state of mind.
However, Yvette said he had still refused to go to the emergency room, despite his condition.
I think a doctor could be on fire and they wouldn't go to the doctor. It would take an act of God for them to actually go.
She said the best they could do was get him to sit down on a bench near the emergency room.
They were trying to coax him along.
Yvette said she'd tried to reason with George.
Dr. Blumenshine was incredibly resistant.
He's combative. He's belligerent.
And when that didn't work,
she takes out her phone and she videotapes what he's doing so she can show him how he's acting.
So he could say that there was obviously something wrong with him.
Last 8 hours or so, I've gotten progressively discoordinated.
Finally, after almost 2 hours at the hospital and more than 8 hours after his symptoms first appeared, Yvette and Anna had gotten George into the ER.
Dr. Gonzalez had to call the emergency room to have 2 physicians come and take Dr. Blumenshine because he wasn't being cooperative.
That's what Yvette told the investigators. But would Anna back up George's girlfriend about the events prior to the poisoning?
Dr. Gonzalez had been with Dr. Blumenshine for most of the entire day.
And when the investigator phoned her to ask for an interview, the cancer researcher said she'd be happy to help just as soon as she was able.
They're very busy people.
George, still in recovery, was in no condition to talk.
He's out of it for, a couple days.
So while waiting to interview Anna, the investigators started talking to her and George's fellow researchers at MD Anderson.
There were a number of colleagues who were not involved in his medical treatment, who were just concerned about how he was doing.
And they feared it might be too late.
Ethylene glycol, it destroys your kidneys.
It was also readily available in the cancer center's labs, according to George's coworkers.
It's used in laboratories for solutions and chemical agents in the laboratory.
It appeared unlikely that the experienced researcher would somehow ingest the substance by accident. But was it possible a jealous colleague had slipped him the poison? George's fellow doctors couldn't think of anyone who might have held a grudge.
The folks that talked about Dr. Blumenshine as a doctor had nothing but glowing things to say.
However, while his colleagues had nothing but praise for him professionally, rumor around the cancer center was that the researcher had a hard time separating his professional and personal life. It was no secret that George and his research partner / protege shared a close bond.
Anna and Dr. Blumenshine spent a tremendous amount of time together.
They would travel the world together, travel to different countries, speaking.
As is often the case in people who work closely together for long hours, their friendship became more intense.
And their conduct became less than professional.
He openly gushed about her, referred to her as his little princess.
Dr. Gonzalez was very touchy-feely with Dr. Blumenshine.
Soon, rumors spread like contagion around the cancer center.
They seemed, to the people in the department, to be growing closer and closer.
Not that anyone had any real proof, of course.
People asked Anna, and Anna would deny it to some people.
But according to what their fellow doctors told police, everyone at MD Anderson knew what was going on between George and Anna.
They were having a fairly torrid love affair.
By Wednesday, February 6, 2013, it had been 10 days since Dr. Ana Gonzalez Angulo's research associate, Dr. George Blumenshine, had fallen mysteriously ill. And 6 days since doctors at Houston's MD Anderson Cancer Center had determined he'd been poisoned.
It took probably 3 to 4 days before we were able to get that it was ethylene glycol that was causing the symptoms.
And ever since then, the 48-year-old had been in the intensive care unit on dialysis.
That's ultimately what saved his life.
George was going to live, but he was far from well. It would be some time before the cancer researcher would be able to give a statement to the police.
He doesn't really come to. He just sleeps and sleeps and sleeps.
However, over the last few days, interviews with his colleagues had produced some very interesting, even scandalous information about Dr. Blumenshine and his 41-year-old research associate.
You know, it was really kind of the worst kept secret at MD Anderson that Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Blumenshine were having a relationship.
And the fact that it was unprofessional wasn't the only reason it was scandalous. Practically everyone at MD Anderson knew that George had been dating another woman, Dr. Yvette Toney, for more than a decade.
Dr. Blumenshine had lived with Yvette Toney for a number of years.
And if the torrid affair wasn't shocking enough, George had been carrying on with Anna even as he and Yvette were attempting to take their relationship to a whole new level.
They're trying to conceive a child together.
Had Yvette found out about the affair and taken revenge on her lover? It seemed plausible, except for one thing. She was the one who'd badgered him into going to the emergency room.
If it weren't for Yvette Toney, Dr. Blumenshine would probably have died.
But did that mean she was innocent, or just that she'd had second thoughts? The investigators weren't sure, and they weren't ready to call her a suspect, not before they interviewed the other woman in the love triangle, Anna Gonzalez Angulo. When the investigators sat down with Anna that Wednesday afternoon, she admitted to having an affair with George, more or less.
She wouldn't come out and say it, but the way she communicated it, it was obviously more than professional.
And according to Anna, that had made someone angry.
Leading up to the poisoning, a letter appeared threatening to out their relationship to their employers.
Anna said that she and George had assumed the letter had come from a colleague.
She said someone at work's jealous of our research.
According to Anna, she and George had ignored the letter, but she also said that whoever was trying to scare them didn't stop.
She also indicated that there were phone calls made to her office phone, threatening phone calls.
Someone had called her office and said, "Stay away from Dr. Blumenshine."
Anna said she had ignored those threats too.
She blew those off. I mean, she just chalked it up to almost a prank phone call.
But based on what happened in December of 2012, whoever made the calls hadn't been joking.
She indicated that she had been assaulted.
According to Anna, two people, a man and a woman, had attacked her outside her townhouse.
She was knocked to the ground.
They beat her, they kicked her in the ribs and in the stomach.
Inexplicably, Anna said her attackers had run off without taking anything, and that she had immediately contacted George.
She and Dr. Blumenshine went to the police department for her to report the assault.
They took photographs of her injuries. She had bruises on her abdomen. She had a bruise on her eye.
An affair, an assault on the other woman, and an attempt to kill the unfaithful boyfriend. It was looking like the investigators had found their suspect.
There would be a logical connection that it could be Yvette Toney.
However, before they made an arrest, there was still one statement the investigators wanted to get: the intended victim. Even after the doctors realized that George had been poisoned, he had spent several weeks in the ICU, near death, but on dialysis.
That's ultimately what saved his life.
And even when he was finally able to talk, he was far from well.
He couldn't move, he couldn't get up.
But as sick as he was, George did confirm that he was having an affair with Anna. According to George, his relationship with Anna had started out as purely professional.
They had worked together very closely for a number of months. They shared patients. They had started researching together.
But George told the investigators that in March 2011, while he and Anna were working late one evening,
Anna started making advances toward Dr. Blumenshine.
They were in front of a computer that she just leaned over and started stroking his neck and stroking his hair and then kissing his neck.
At least that's the way George claimed the affair had started.
He said she was definitely the aggressor in the relationship.
George said that he'd tried to keep things professional, But then, in the fall of 2011, when he and Anna were at a conference in Sweden.
They ended up staying in a hotel together, and that's when their sexual relationship commenced.
But according to George, their sexual relations were limited.
Their relationship was always him receiving oral sex.
They had never actually consummated their relationship as far as full sexual intercourse goes.
George claimed that Anna had always wanted to sleep with him, but he said he just couldn't do that to Yvette.
Actually having sex with Anna would be on an entirely different level of betrayal to him.
The investigators weren't so sure Yvette would see it that way. But when they started asking if she might be the one behind the attempt on his life, George said no.
Yvette didn't even learn anything about this until he was lying in the hospital almost dead.
And according to George, she only knew because he had confessed to the affair when he feared he was going to die.
He came clean with Yvette.
George claimed his confession had caught Yvette completely by surprise.
She felt like such a fool.
So according to George, Yvette didn't have a motive to try and murder him.
Yvette did nothing wrong except love a man who cheated on her.
So how did George explain the poison, the threatening letters and phone calls, and the attack on Anna outside her townhouse?
There was an amazing amount of strange and weird incidents.
George didn't deny that, and he knew when they started, too. And it didn't have anything to do with Yvette discovering his affair. George told the investigators that he and Yvette had recently decided to try and have a child together.
While Dr. Blumenshine was carrying on with Dr. Gonzalez, Yvette Tony did get pregnant.
Understandably, he hadn't shared the good news with Anna.
He didn't tell her that Yvette had gotten pregnant.
However, in the fall of 2012, that pregnancy had ended in a devastating miscarriage.
They're both very distraught and very upset.
So upset that Anna knew something was wrong.
She pressed him enough, and he admitted that she had a miscarriage.
And then, shortly after,
these bizarre things start happening.
In hindsight, George said it should have been obvious that the threatening letters and phone calls began after Anna learned he and Yvette were trying to have a baby.
She ended up figuring out what was going on, that she and Dr. Blumenshine weren't going to end up together.
However, prior to the attempt on his life,
he didn't want to believe it.
So despite all the threats and what appeared to be an assault on Anna,
Dr. Blumenshine carried on with Dr. Gonzalez while all this was going on.
In fact, George told the police that he'd even dropped by Anna's townhouse on the morning of January 27th, just a few hours before he'd fallen ill.
He picked her up and took her upstairs, literally swept her off her feet. They go upstairs to have oral sex.
And afterward, before he got dressed to go into the cancer center,
Anna had said, "I made this special Colombian coffee just for you."
In a hurry to get to the lab, George said he tried to refuse the offer, but
it's very important to her, according to him, that he try this very, very special Colombian coffee from her homeland.
With Anna insisting, George said he'd relented and agreed to try it, and immediately regretted it.
It's just sickeningly sweet.
But since it seemed so important to Anna,
he forces it down as much as he can.
Dr. Blumenshine doesn't want to be rude and doesn't want to seem like he's ungrateful.
And as he told the investigators, his attempt to be polite had very nearly cost him his life.
The moment he woke up, after having been on the intensive care unit, he knew what happened.
Ethylene glycol is known to have a saturating, sweet taste.
Now that they had George's statement, the police had a new suspect, although they didn't immediately arrest the cancer researcher.
It required a 3-month grand jury investigation in order for us to make a decision and really gather all the evidence that we needed.
But finally, on May 29, 2014, the authorities were ready.
They went and arrested her at the parking garage at MD Anderson.
And her reaction when the arresting officers told Anna that she was being charged with aggravated assault. Stunned disbelief.
She responded, I just talked to George about this. I told him it was Yvette.
When Dr. Ana Gonzalez Angulo stood trial on September 15, 2014, the 43-year-old cancer researcher wasn't the typical criminal defendant.
She was an amazing doctor. She did a lot of really influential, groundbreaking work in breast cancer.
This isn't just someone who you just pick off the street like an everyday criminal.
She was someone who probably saved countless lives.
But according to the prosecution, she was a criminal. Accused of poisoning her lover, Dr. George Blumenshine, she was on trial for aggravated assault.
It's a first-degree felony. It carried a punishment range of between 5 years and 99 years or life in prison.
And according to the prosecution, the fact that Ana was a world-renowned cancer researcher who'd saved countless lives didn't absolve her of the crime. If anything, the prosecutors believe that made what she'd allegedly done even worse.
Ana Maria Gonzalez Angulo is one of the most conniving, cunning, and calculated defendants I have ever prosecuted.
In his opening statement, the prosecutor said that the attempt on George's life started with the affair he'd been having with Ana since 2011, an affair the prosecutors claimed that Ana had taken far more seriously than George.
The defendant had a fatal attraction.
George, on the other hand, had seen their relationship as a fling, prosecutors claimed. There was no way he would leave Yvette Tony, his girlfriend of 17 years.
They had planned to have this child.
And according to the prosecutors, that had infuriated Ana.
She became absolutely and totally obsessed with him and wanting him.
And if she couldn't have him,
Then nobody was going to have him.
but the poison hadn't killed George. On September 19th, the cancer researcher took the stand to testify against his former lover.
Are you proud of what you did with the defendant without...
No, I regret it deeply.
And George said he had no doubt that it was Ana who tried to poison him.
He knew in his heart of hearts that it was that coffee.
Although, as George and the prosecutors explained to the jury, he never let on to Ana that he suspected her. In fact, he remained in contact with her in the months between the poisoning and her arrest.
One critical thing he wound up doing was, as the investigation went on, he started recording his conversations with the defendant.
Tapes that were played for the jury.
Hours of her on the phone, saying all sorts of things.
First, she blew off the police investigators as amateurs.
I don't think this Thomas is going to find anything.
Then she told George that she'd taken things into her own hands.
Have you watched?
She had told him she'd brought a bodyguard from Colombia and a private investigator.
And according to Ana, her investigator had uncovered evidence that Yvette was behind everything, including the threats and the attack on her.
If I tell you that I have enough circumstantial evidence to press charges, will you believe me?
No.
I do.
Against Yvette?
Yes.
I think the ultimate goal was to convince everyone that Yvette was responsible for this, so she could have George Blumenshine all to herself.
But what Ana didn't know was that the whole time she was attempting to play George, he was playing her.
You hear her, in her own words, say these things. Even as a prosecutor, if someone told me, I'd have a hard time believing.
And if the private detective did have evidence against Yvette, as Ana claimed, why hadn't she come forward with it prior to her arrest? According to the prosecutors, the answer was simple. She'd made the whole thing up, just like the threatening phone calls.
I couldn't find one call coming into her office extension on the dates and times that she indicated.
And the assault outside her townhouse.
Police didn't believe that the bruises fit what she was trying to say had happened to her. They weren't significant enough to be beaten the way she said she'd gotten beaten.
And as for her alleged motive, Yvette took the stand after George and testified that what he'd previously told the police was true. She'd had no idea about the affair.
I trusted her. I trusted him.
In fact, Yvette testified that until George confessed to her from what he thought might be his deathbed, she'd naively thought all those late nights at the lab and conference trips were entirely innocent.
I felt betrayed.
Besides, according to the prosecution's toxicology experts, there was no way Yvette could have poisoned George.
If he had been poisoned on Friday or Saturday, when he presented to the emergency room, the intoxication would have worn off by that point.
The only person with the opportunity, the means, and the motive was Anna.
The defense disagreed on all three counts. For opportunity, they questioned the timeline put forth by the toxicology experts.
It could have occurred potentially the night before.
They also argued that Yvette, the wronged woman in the love triangle, had far more of a motive than Anna.
Yvette Toney was a logical suspect.
And as far as Anna's motive, the defense claimed that her relationship with George was a far cry from the fatal attraction obsession that the prosecutors described.
She saw this as nothing more than a very casual relationship.
One they said wasn't at all threatened by Yvette's pregnancy.
Dr. Toney had already been pregnant with Dr. Blumenshine, and he had continued to carry on with Dr. Gonzalez.
And the fatal attraction part? According to the defense, George had made that up to make himself more of a victim in Yvette's eyes.
This consensual relationship has in fact been recast to heal wounds.
Which was another point the defense made sure to make for the jury. The prosecution's entire case hinged on the testimony of a man who'd had an illicit affair behind his girlfriend's back, even after she'd suffered a devastating miscarriage.
I didn't think he came across as sympathetic. I didn't think he came across as believable.
He had lied to a great number of people.
And as far as Anna having the means to poison George, the defense wrapped up its case by asking, why would such a gifted scientist use such a simple, easily traceable poison as ethylene glycol?
If she wanted to hurt this man, this woman was smart enough to figure out to do it in a way that would be hard for others to figure out.
On September 26, 2014, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict in the trial of Dr. Ana Gonzalez Angulo. The 43-year-old Colombian immigrant and breast cancer researcher was accused of poisoning her lover, Dr. George Blumenshine.
We had charged her with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and the deadly weapon was ethylene glycol.
At trial, the prosecution argued that Anna had tried to kill her lover after learning he was trying to have a child with his longtime girlfriend, Dr. Yvette Toney.
It was because I'm not going to have him, no one's going to have him.
Meanwhile, in an effort to raise reasonable doubt, the defense suggested that the woman George had cheated on had just as much opportunity and an even better motive to want him dead.
We as her lawyers felt that Yvette Toney knew that this relationship was going on, or at least strongly suspected it.
Which had the jury believed.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Ana Maria Gonzalez Angulo, guilty of aggravated assault.
The guilty verdict stunned the defense.
All of us collectively felt like we had gotten punched in the gut.
But no one was more shocked than Anna.
I think she thought she was going to get away with this because her whole life she was the smartest person in school, smartest person in medical school, and she was a star at MD Anderson.
However, when the trial shifted to the sentencing phase, the world-renowned scientist not only faced a possible life sentence, she also had one last chance to avoid prison altogether.
She was eligible for the jury to give her probation.
In the penalty phase, Anna's attorneys argued that the brilliant cancer researcher belonged in her lab, not behind bars.
We felt like she was an ideal probation candidate.
To prove their point, They put a series of the doctor's patients on the stand.
It was very emotional. We heard from women who had suffered through breast cancer.
I've been fighting this since 1995, and I wouldn't be here today without her.
The patients that testified on our behalf in the penalty phase loved her.
But would the emotional testimony from her former patients make a difference when the jury announced its decision on September 29?
She ended up being sentenced to 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine.
The defense considered that a victory.
They could have gone all the way up to life.
However, for the prosecutors, the fact that the world-class cancer researcher will serve time sent a powerful message.
And that message is that it doesn't matter who you are, it matters what you do.
The summer of 1962 arrived in Boston with the quiet confidence of a city that believed it knew itself. Morning commuters filled the sidewalks before sunrise. Neighborhood bakeries welcomed familiar customers, and apartment windows stood open to invite the warm air drifting in from the harbor. It was a city built on routine, where faces became recognizable after only a few walks down the same street, and strangers were often greeted with cautious kindness rather than suspicion. In many residential neighborhoods, it was not unusual for doors to remain unlocked during the daytime. Delivery workers came and went. Maintenance staff visited apartment buildings without attracting attention. And people who introduced themselves as repairmen or inspectors were rarely questioned at length. Trust was woven into everyday life. It was an ordinary habit, almost invisible to those who lived there. Yet it would become one of the most haunting details in one of America's most debated criminal investigations. Long before the name, the Boston Strangler appeared in newspaper headlines. Before investigators assembled one of the largest homicide investigations the city had ever witnessed. And before millions of Americans learned to associate Boston with fear instead of history, 13 women would become linked by a mystery that remains unresolved decades later. Even today, more than half a century after the murders, one central question refuses to disappear. Were all 13 women killed by the same individual? Or did investigators and the public unknowingly combine several separate crimes into a single terrifying legend? That uncertainty has transformed the Boston Strangler from a criminal case into an enduring historical puzzle, one whose answers remain incomplete despite advances in forensic science and years of renewed investigation. The story begins not with a notorious suspect, a dramatic confession, or a courtroom verdict. It begins with an ordinary woman living an ordinary life inside an ordinary apartment. On a summer afternoon that should have passed unnoticed, Anna Lesniak-Sleezers was 55 years old. Originally from Latvia, she had built a quiet life in Boston after enduring the hardships that had shaped much of Europe during the previous decades. Widowed and living alone, she was known by neighbors as careful and private. She did not have a reputation for recklessness, nor was she known for welcoming strangers into her home without reason. Like many residents in the city, however, she lived in a community where everyday interactions with unfamiliar people rarely inspired fear. Service workers, delivery personnel, and maintenance employees moved through apartment buildings as part of normal life. Nothing suggested that opening a door could become a fatal decision. On June 14, 1962, concern replaced routine when Anna's son arrived to visit his mother. The visit should have been uneventful. Instead, repeated attempts to reach her received no response. As worry grew, he entered the apartment and encountered a scene that immediately shattered any expectation of normality. Anna was lying on the floor, The belt from her bathrobe had been wrapped tightly around her neck. Her clothing had been disturbed, and investigators would later determine that she had died from mechanical asphyxiation caused by strangulation. There were also indications that she had been sexually assaulted, although the forensic limitations of the early 1960s meant that many questions could not be answered with certainty. Perhaps even more unsettling was what investigators did not find. The apartment showed almost no evidence of forced entry. There were no broken locks, no shattered windows, and no obvious signs that someone had violently forced their way inside. Little property appeared to be missing. Robbery did not seem to provide a convincing explanation for the crime. Instead, the evidence suggested a possibility that was deeply unsettling. Whoever had entered Anna's apartment may have done so because she willingly opened the door. At the time, detectives approached the homicide as an isolated event. Every city experiences murders that emerge from personal conflicts, domestic disputes, robberies gone wrong, or countless other circumstances. Nothing immediately indicated that Anna's death represented the beginning of something larger. The investigation focused on identifying anyone who may have known her, retracing her recent activities, and searching for evidence that might point toward a specific suspect. No one yet imagined that her name would become the first in a list that would eventually stretch to 13. Yet only 2 weeks later, another woman would be found dead under circumstances that were impossible to ignore. Then another followed almost immediately afterward. As similarities accumulated, coincidence became increasingly difficult to accept. The pattern emerging before investigators was unlike anything Boston had recently experienced. The victims were women. Many lived alone. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. Strangulation appeared repeatedly as the method of killing. These similarities gradually transformed individual homicide investigations into something much more alarming. Detectives found themselves confronting the possibility that a single offender might be moving through the city with alarming confidence. While investigators struggled to interpret the growing pattern, the public knew almost nothing about what was unfolding. Daily life continued across Boston. Families attended work and school. Shops opened each morning. Apartment hallways echoed with the ordinary sounds of neighbors greeting one another. Few residents understood that the assumptions underpinning their sense of security were already beginning to fracture. The absence of forced entry in Anna's apartment quietly introduced a terrifying implication. If victims were voluntarily opening their doors, then the offender did not need extraordinary physical strength or sophisticated burglary skills. Instead, he may have relied on something far more common, and therefore far more dangerous: the ability to appear trustworthy. Investigators later considered the possibility that the offender presented himself as a maintenance worker, a delivery employee, or someone requesting assistance. Such explanations fit naturally within the customs of the time. In the early 1960s, refusing entry to someone claiming to perform legitimate work was far less common than it would become in later decades. This possibility also explained why apartments frequently showed no signs of forced entry. It suggested not only planning but patience, social confidence, and an understanding of ordinary human behavior. If true, the offender's greatest weapon may not have been the ligature eventually used to kill his victims. It may have been the simple act of convincing another person that he belonged on the other side of the door. As investigators worked through the first homicide, they possessed neither the forensic technology nor the investigative tools that would later transform criminal investigations. DNA analysis did not exist. Surveillance cameras were absent from residential buildings. Digital records, mobile phone data, and countless modern investigative resources remained decades away. Detectives relied heavily upon witness interviews, physical observations, fingerprints when available, and painstaking comparisons between individual cases. Every decision required patience, and every unanswered question carried the possibility that another victim might soon follow. The coming months would confirm those fears. The murders did not remain isolated incidents. Instead, Boston entered a period during which each new homicide deepened public anxiety and challenged investigators searching for answers with increasingly limited resources. Newspapers would eventually give the unknown offender a name that would become permanently embedded in American criminal history: the Boston Strangler. Yet behind that infamous title stood 13 women, 13 interrupted lives, in an investigation that would evolve into one of the largest and most controversial homicide inquiries the United States had ever seen. Decades later, despite renewed forensic testing and advances in DNA technology, the mystery would remain only partially resolved. One suspect would confess. One victim's case would later be linked to him through modern science. But whether every murder belonged to the same killer would remain an unanswered question, ensuring that the story of the Boston Strangler would endure not simply as the account of a serial murder investigation, but as a cautionary reminder that history sometimes preserves mysteries even when it uncovers new evidence. And before detectives would chase leads across Boston, before thousands of interviews and fingerprints would be collected, before Albert DeSalvo's name entered the investigation, there were only 3 unexplained deaths separated by days rather than years. Those first discoveries would slowly transform a quiet city into one living under the shadow of uncertainty, where every unexpected knock at the door carried a question that no resident had previously thought to ask. Who was standing outside, and could they truly be trusted? June 14, 1962, did not immediately appear destined to become a date remembered in American criminal history. To the detectives assigned to the scene, the death of 55-year-old Anna Lesniak Sleezers first resembled the kind of isolated homicide that every major city eventually confronts. Their responsibility was to document the apartment, collect every piece of physical evidence available, speak with relatives and neighbors, and determine who might have wished to harm a woman whose life appeared remarkably quiet. Yet from a moment investigators stepped inside her residence, they encountered details that resisted simple explanation. Anna had been living alone following the death of her husband. Friends and neighbors described her as cautious, reserved, and independent. She maintained familiar routines and had little reason to invite unknown visitors into her apartment. Without a believable explanation, the apartment itself revealed surprisingly little evidence of chaos. Furniture remained largely in place. There were no broken windows, no damaged locks, and no obvious indication that someone had forced entry. The absence of those signs became nearly as important as the evidence investigators did find. Anna's body lay on the floor, and the belt from her bathrobe had been wrapped tightly around her neck. Medical examination later concluded that she had died from mechanical asphyxiation caused by strangulation. Investigators also documented indications of sexual assault, although the forensic limitations of the era prevented many questions from being answered with certainty. In 1962, investigators lacked DNA analysis and many of the scientific techniques that later generations would consider standard. Much depended upon careful observation, witness interviews, fingerprints when available, and painstaking comparison between crime scenes. During those first hours, detectives attempted to reconstruct Anna's final day. Who had visited her? Had anyone noticed unfamiliar people entering the building? Had neighbors heard an argument or signs of a struggle? Each interview produced fragments of ordinary daily life, but no clear suspect. Nothing suggested that Anna had recently feared for her safety. Nothing immediately identified someone who might have targeted her specifically. Without signs of forced entry, detectives considered an unsettling possibility, and had likely opened her own door. If true, the person standing outside must have appeared harmless enough to gain her confidence, at least for a brief moment. At that stage, however, investigators still viewed the murder as a single tragedy rather than the beginning of a larger pattern. Their attention remained focused on solving one homicide. That assumption lasted only 2 weeks. On June 28th, another woman was found dead. Nina Nichols was 68 years old and, like Anna, lived alone. Once again, investigators entered an apartment that showed no obvious signs of forced entry. Once again, strangulation emerged as the cause of death. Little property appeared to have been taken, making robbery an increasingly unconvincing motive. Detectives who had worked Anna's case immediately recognized similarities that were difficult to dismiss. The victims belonged to a similar demographic, both living independently, both attacked inside their own homes, and both apparently allowing their killer to enter voluntarily. Although similarities between two crimes can sometimes occur by coincidence, experienced investigators understand that repeated patterns deserve careful attention. Police began comparing reports line by line, searching for overlooked connections that might identify a common offender. They examined timelines, victim backgrounds, apartment locations, and available physical evidence. Yet despite these efforts, no clear suspect emerged. Before detectives could determine whether the first 2 murders were linked, another call demanded their attention. On June 30th, only 2 days after Nina Nichols' body had been discovered, 65-year-old Helen Blake was found dead. Once again, the victim had been strangled. Once again, investigators found no convincing evidence that someone had broken into the apartment. The method of killing closely resembled the previous cases, including the use of materials found within the residence itself. 3 women had now been killed within just over 2 weeks. Individually, each case presented challenges. Together, they began to form a pattern that investigators could no longer ignore. The growing similarities forced detectives to ask whether Boston was confronting something far more unusual than a series of unrelated homicides. Behind closed doors, discussions shifted from solving isolated crimes to considering the possibility of a serial offender. Publicly, authorities remained cautious, prematurely announcing the existence of a serial killer risked creating unnecessary panic, particularly if later evidence proved otherwise. Nevertheless, detectives quietly expanded their investigation. They began comparing every available detail between the 3 crime scenes, hoping that a consistent characteristic would point toward the offender's identity. The absence of forced entry remained one of the strongest recurring elements. Investigators consider how an unknown man could repeatedly gain access to women living alone, without immediately provoking alarm. One theory gradually gained credibility. The offender may have presented himself as someone performing legitimate work. He could have claimed to be a maintenance employee, a delivery worker, or another individual whose presence would appear ordinary within an apartment building. Such explanations required no elaborate deception because residents of the early 1960s routinely encountered workers entering buildings for repairs, deliveries, or inspections. A polite introduction and a believable reason for visiting might have been enough to persuade someone to unlock the door. This theory could not be proven, but it fit the physical evidence available. It also explained why apartments showed little evidence of violent entry and why victims may have had little opportunity to prepare for an attack. Once inside, the offender would have enjoyed the advantage of surprise. Investigators also recognized another troubling implication. If the killer relied upon appearing trustworthy rather than forcing entry, virtually any woman living alone could become vulnerable. There would be no broken window to warn neighbors, no loud attempt to force a lock, and no obvious signal that danger had arrived. Instead, the attack could begin with nothing more alarming than a knock at the door. As police worked through growing stacks of reports, Boston itself remained largely unaware of how rapidly the investigation was changing. Most residents learned only fragments through newspaper coverage. Yet even those early reports began attracting attention. 3 women had died under remarkably similar circumstances in less than 3 weeks. Questions naturally followed. Was someone deliberately targeting women inside their homes? Were investigators searching for one offender or several? The uncertainty itself became a source of anxiety. For detectives, however, uncertainty carried a different burden. Every unsolved day increased the possibility that another murder might occur before the offender was identified. Without modern forensic technology, investigators depended heavily upon interviews and physical comparisons between crime scenes. Thousands of observations had to be documented by hand. Every fingerprint required manual comparison. Every witness account demanded careful evaluation. Leads that initially appeared promising often dissolved under closer examination, while seemingly insignificant details occasionally became the focus of renewed attention. Yet despite exhaustive efforts, the investigation remained frustratingly incomplete. No eyewitness could confidently identify the offender. No decisive physical evidence immediately connected a suspect to all 3 scenes. Detectives were left balancing probability against proof, recognizing similarities while lacking definitive confirmation. The challenge facing them extended beyond solving 3 murders. They also needed to determine whether those murders truly belonged together. This distinction would become one of the defining questions of the entire Boston Strangler investigation. If investigators incorrectly grouped unrelated crimes, they risked overlooking the real offender in individual cases. If they treated connected murders separately, they might fail to recognize the movements of a serial killer operating across the city. It was a dilemma with profound consequences, and one that would continue to shape the investigation for years. As summer continued, Boston had not yet adopted the phrase that would eventually dominate newspaper headlines. The name Boston Strangler had not fully entered the public imagination. But inside police headquarters, concern was growing. 3 women had died in circumstances too similar to dismiss. Detectives understood that unless the pattern ended or a suspect was identified, the city might soon face another victim. Their fears would prove well-founded. The murders did not stop. Instead, they evolved, eventually expanding beyond the initial victim profile and forcing investigators to reconsider nearly every assumption they had formed during those first weeks of the investigation. What began with Anna Sleezer's as an apparently isolated homicide was becoming something far larger, more frightening, and far more difficult to explain than anyone could have imagined in June 1962. As investigators continued comparing reports from the first 3 murders, an uncomfortable realization settled over police headquarters. The similarities between the victims could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Yet there remained too little evidence to identify a suspect with confidence. Each case added another layer of uncertainty rather than clarity. Detectives understood that the absence of forced entry, the repeated use of strangulation, and the fact that the victims lived alone suggested a deliberate pattern. At the same time, they knew that patterns could be deceptive. The challenge was to distinguish genuine connections from superficial similarities before another woman lost her life. The weeks that followed demonstrated that the investigation was entering an even more troubling phase. On August 21, 1962, 75-year-old Ida Erga became the next woman whose death would later be associated with the Boston Strangler investigation. Like the earlier victims, she lived alone. Once again, investigators encountered circumstances that echoed the previous murders. The victim had been strangled, and there was no convincing indication that the offender had forced entry into the residence. Detectives carefully documented every observable detail, searching for anything that might separate this crime from those that had preceded it. Instead, they found additional reasons to believe the same offender could be responsible. Every new similarity strengthened one theory while simultaneously increasing public danger. If one individual had indeed committed multiple murders, that person was continuing to operate without attracting enough attention to be identified. Only days later, on August 30th, 67-year-old Jane Sullivan was found dead under circumstances that investigators again believed were potentially connected. The growing list of victims was impossible to ignore. Police were no longer dealing with isolated investigations, but with what increasingly appeared to be a series of related homicides. As detectives assembled timelines, compared witness statements, and reviewed crime scene reports, they repeatedly returned to the same disturbing observation. There were remarkably few signs of violent entry. Doors had not been smashed open. Windows had not been broken. Apartments generally showed little indication of prolonged struggles before the fatal attacks. This recurring feature continued to support the theory that the victims themselves had admitted the offender into their homes. Investigators considered several possibilities that fit the available evidence. The individual might have presented himself as a maintenance employee responding to routine building work. He might have claimed to be making a delivery or requesting assistance. Whatever explanation had been offered, detectives believed it was convincing enough to overcome the natural caution of women living alone. In the early 1960s, such encounters were common and rarely viewed with suspicion. Apartment residents routinely interacted with repair personnel, delivery workers, and building employees whose presence seemed entirely ordinary. The offender appeared to understand this everyday reality and, if investigators were correct, exploited it repeatedly. As more information reached newspapers, Boston's sense of security began to change. Stories describing women found murdered inside their own homes spread rapidly across the city. Residents who had once considered unlocked doors an ordinary part of neighborhood life started questioning habits they had never previously examined. Hardware stores reported increasing demand for stronger locks and additional security devices. Women living alone became especially concerned, recognizing that every known victim had been attacked inside the place where she should have been safest. Self-defense products sold quickly, and many people began refusing to answer unexpected knocks unless they recognized the visitor. Although investigators could not publicly confirm every detail of the ongoing inquiry, the atmosphere throughout Boston had already begun to shift from concern to genuine fear. The investigation entered another significant phase on December 5, 1962, when 20-year-old Sophie Clark was discovered dead. Her murder immediately attracted extraordinary attention because it differed from earlier cases in one crucial respect. Sophie was far younger than the previous victims. Until then, investigators had largely been examining attacks against older women living alone. Sophie's age challenged assumptions that detectives had gradually developed over the preceding months. If the same offender had committed this murder, then his victim selection was broader than previously believed. If not, investigators faced the possibility that more than one offender might be responsible for crimes that appeared superficially similar. At Sophie's apartment, investigators documented details consistent with earlier murders. She had been found lying on her bed. A nylon stocking had been used to strangle her. The apartment showed little evidence of extensive disturbance or theft. Once again, detectives believed there had been no forced entry, suggesting that Sophie had voluntarily opened the door or otherwise allowed the offender inside. The similarities could not be ignored, yet neither could the differences. Detectives now confronted an increasingly difficult question. Had the offender deliberately changed his preferred victim profile, or had investigators mistakenly combined separate crimes into a single investigation? This uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of the Boston Strangler case and would continue to shape debate for decades before police could fully reassess their theories. Another young victim was added to the growing list. On December 31st, 1962, 23-year-old Patricia Bissett was found murdered. Once more, investigators observed a scene that appeared carefully controlled. Reports indicated little evidence of a major struggle. The victim had been strangled, and detectives again noted the absence of obvious forced entry. To experienced investigators, these repeated characteristics suggested an offender who relied less upon overwhelming physical violence than upon surprise and control. The attacks appeared to unfold quickly after the offender gained access to the residence, limiting opportunities for victims to resist or attract attention from neighbors. Every additional murder expanded the investigation. Detectives compared physical evidence across crime scenes, reviewed reports involving known sexual offenders, and conducted interviews on an extraordinary scale. Ultimately, the investigation would involve hundreds of officers, more than 8,000 interviews, and the examination of thousands of fingerprints. Yet despite this enormous commitment of resources, the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The available evidence was insufficient to identify one individual beyond reasonable doubt. Modern forensic techniques capable of recovering and comparing DNA did not yet exist. Surveillance cameras capable of documenting movements into apartment buildings were absent. Investigators instead relied upon patient, methodical police work that often produced more questions than answers. As fear spread through Boston, ordinary routines changed dramatically. Women living alone increasingly replaced locks, purchased additional security devices, and enrolled in self-defense classes. Some reportedly kept knives or baseball bats near their beds while sleeping. Neighbors who once greeted unfamiliar visitors with little concern became noticeably more cautious. Apartment managers received questions about building security that previously would have seemed unnecessary. Newspapers continued reporting each new development, ensuring that the investigation remained at the forefront of public attention. The name Boston Strangler gradually became inseparable from the city's identity during this period, symbolizing not only an unknown offender, but also the uncertainty that surrounded every stage of the investigation. Despite growing public anxiety, detectives remained careful in their conclusions. They understood that similarities between cases did not automatically prove a single offender. Every homicide required independent evaluation, and every assumption needed supporting evidence. Nevertheless, the accumulating pattern could not be dismissed. Women living alone continued to be attacked inside their homes. Strangulation remained the recurring method of killing, and forced entry continued to be notably absent from many of the crime scenes. These common elements sustained the working theory that one offender might still be responsible for multiple murders. Yet beneath that apparent consistency lay subtle differences that investigators could not easily explain. Victim ages now range from young adults to elderly women. Some crime scenes contained indications of sexual assault, while others did not. Certain details appeared carefully staged, whereas others seemed less consistent. Detectives recognized that every difference mattered, but without stronger forensic evidence, they could not determine whether those differences reflected the evolving behavior of one offender or the actions of several unrelated individuals. That uncertainty would remain unresolved throughout the active investigation and continue long after. The murders themselves had ended. By the beginning of 1963, Boston had become a city transformed by fear. Every unexpected knock at an apartment door carried new significance. Every report of another woman living alone invited immediate concern. Police continued working relentlessly, expanding an investigation that had already become one of the largest homicide inquiries in the city's history. Yet the unknown offender, or offenders, remained unidentified. The murders had evolved beyond a series of tragic deaths into a mystery that challenged every assumption investigators attempted to make. The next phase of the case would deepen that uncertainty even further, introducing crimes whose differences would eventually become central to the enduring debate over whether the Boston Strangler was one man, several killers, or a combination of unrelated tragedies brought together under a single infamous name. By the opening months of 1963, Boston had become a city living with an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. What had begun the previous summer as a series of disturbing but seemingly isolated homicides had developed into an investigation unlike anything local law enforcement had previously encountered. Residents no longer viewed the murders as distant events affecting strangers in another neighborhood. Instead, every new headline reinforced the realization that the victims had been attacked inside their own homes, places traditionally regarded as the safest environments a person could occupy. The psychological impact extended well beyond the families directly affected. Ordinary routines changed throughout the city as fear quietly reshaped daily life. Women who lived alone became particularly cautious. Many replaced existing locks with stronger ones or added additional security devices to apartment doors. Hardware stores experienced increased demand for locks, chains, and other protective equipment. Self-defense classes attracted individuals who only months earlier might never have imagined needing such instruction. Some women reportedly kept knives or baseball bats close to their beds while they slept, hoping that preparation might provide at least some measure of protection should danger arrive unexpectedly. Neighbors who once opened their doors without hesitation now paused before responding to a knock, questioning whether the person outside truly belonged there. The possibility that an offender could rely on ordinary appearances rather than forced entry transformed simple, everyday interactions into moments of uncertainty. Throughout this period, newspapers continued reporting every significant development. The phrase Boston Strangler became increasingly common, providing the public with a single name that seemed to explain a series of frightening events. Even though investigators themselves still faced profound uncertainty regarding whether all of the murders had actually been committed by the same individual, the name quickly entered public conversation. But it also carried the risk of encouraging assumptions that the available evidence had not yet fully established. Detectives remained aware that similarities between cases did not automatically prove a single offender, and they continued evaluating each homicide individually while also searching for broader connections. Behind the scenes, the investigation expanded dramatically. Hundreds of investigators became involved as police committed extraordinary resources to solving the growing series of murders. More than 8,000 people would eventually be interviewed. Thousands of fingerprints were collected and compared. Records involving known sexual offenders were carefully reviewed in hopes that an overlooked connection might identify the person responsible. Every lead, regardless of how minor it initially appeared, required evaluation. Detectives recognized that the smallest inconsistency or forgotten observation might become the key to understanding the pattern that had emerged across multiple crime scenes. Yet despite this remarkable effort, investigators confronted limitations that modern detectives would scarcely recognize. DNA analysis had not yet been developed as an investigative tool. Biological evidence could not be compared with the precision available decades later. Residential surveillance cameras did not exist to document movements into apartment buildings. Digital communication records, mobile phone data, and computerized criminal databases remained technologies of the future. Instead, detectives depended upon interviews, handwritten reports, fingerprint comparisons, and careful observation of physical evidence. Every conclusion required patience, and many questions simply could not be answered with the scientific resources available at the time. The investigation demanded not only persistence but restraint. Detectives understood that prematurely identifying the wrong suspect could permanently damage the credibility of the inquiry while allowing the actual offender to remain free. Consequently, investigators repeatedly returned to the physical evidence already available. They compared crime scene photographs, analyzed victim backgrounds, reviewed witness statements, and attempted to determine whether a consistent behavioral pattern truly existed. Among the most significant observations remained the repeated absence of forced entry. Investigators continued believing that many victims had voluntarily opened their doors, perhaps after encountering someone who appeared to have a legitimate reason for visiting. Whether the individual presented himself as a maintenance worker, a delivery employee, or someone requesting assistance, detectives believed that trust played a critical role in allowing the attacks to occur. This possibility deeply unsettled the public because it suggested that ordinary politeness and routine social interactions had been transformed into opportunities for violence. On May 8, 1963, another murder complicated the investigation even further. Beverly Simmons, a 23-year-old schoolteacher, was found dead inside her home. Almost immediately, detectives recognized that this crime differed in several important respects from many of the earlier murders associated with the Boston Strangler investigation. Beverly had suffered multiple stab wounds before being strangled. The presence of a knife as part of the attack introduced a level of violence not consistently observed in the previous cases. Investigators also noted that the crime scene appeared considerably more chaotic than several earlier murder locations. These differences raised difficult questions that would remain central to debates surrounding the case for decades. If one offender had committed every murder, detectives needed to explain why the method of killing appeared to change so significantly. Criminal behavior can evolve, and investigators understood that offenders do not always repeat identical actions from one crime to another. Nevertheless, major departures from an established pattern require careful scrutiny. Beverly Simmons' murder, therefore, became one of the strongest reasons many later researchers questioned whether all 13 victims truly belonged within a single series. Some modern investigators have argued that this homicide may have been committed by someone entirely different, even though it became associated with the broader Boston Strangler investigation. At the time, however, detectives could not easily separate the cases. Too many similarities remained, and too little definitive evidence existed to justify dividing the investigation into unrelated groups. Consequently, Beverly's death remained part of the expanding inquiry while investigators continued searching for stronger proof capable of clarifying the relationships between individual crimes. Every additional victim intensified pressure upon law enforcement. Public confidence depended upon visible progress. Yet genuine investigative progress remained frustratingly slow. Detectives continued interviewing witnesses, examining known offenders, and comparing evidence across every homicide connected to the investigation. Despite their efforts, no single suspect could be conclusively linked to the entire series. This absence of certainty increasingly defined the investigation itself, rather than moving steadily toward a solution. Detectives found themselves confronting an ever-expanding collection of unanswered questions. As months passed, fear became woven into the rhythm of everyday life throughout Boston. Apartment residents developed new habits. Unexpected visitors were viewed with suspicion rather than courtesy. Friends and relatives checked more frequently on loved ones who lived alone. The murders had altered not only investigative priorities, but also the daily behavior of an entire city. The emotional consequences extended far beyond those directly touched by violence, illustrating how an unidentified offender could reshape public life without ever being seen. Investigators remained determined to continue their work despite mounting frustration. Every crime scene was documented with extraordinary care according to the standards of the period. Every available witness was questioned. Every physical clue received attention. Yet the fundamental obstacles persisted. Without DNA technology or comprehensive forensic resources, detectives often found themselves relying upon probabilities rather than definitive proof. Similarities between murders suggested connections, but similarities alone could not establish guilt. Differences raised doubts, but differences alone could not eliminate the possibility of a single offender. This delicate balance between evidence and uncertainty became one of the defining features of the Boston Strangler investigation. Looking back decades later, historians and criminologists would repeatedly revisit these same questions, examining whether investigators had correctly grouped the murders or whether several unrelated crimes had gradually merged into one infamous narrative through circumstance and public perception. During 1963, however, such historical analysis remained impossible. Detectives faced only the immediate reality before them. Another young woman had been killed. Another investigation had expanded, and the individual or individuals responsible remained unidentified. Boston continued waiting for answers that refused to emerge, while investigators prepared themselves for the possibility that the series had not yet reached its conclusion. Their fears would soon prove justified. As additional victims later that year and the opening days of 1964 would ultimately shape the enduring legacy of one of the most controversial criminal investigations in American history, leaving behind questions that would survive long after the murders themselves had ended. As 1963 progressed, investigators found themselves confronting an investigation that had grown beyond anything they had anticipated when Anna Sleezers was found dead the previous summer. The expanding case had already demanded extraordinary resources. Yet the central questions remained unanswered. Was Boston truly witnessing the work of a single serial offender? Or had investigators unintentionally combined several unrelated murders into one increasingly complex investigation? Every new crime seemed capable of supporting either conclusion, depending upon which details received the greatest emphasis. Similarities encouraged the theory of one killer, while differences continually challenged it. This tension would define the remainder of the case. During the latter half of 1963, additional murders were associated with what had become widely known as the Boston Strangler investigation. Among them was the death of Evelyn Corbin, a 58-year-old woman whose murder on September 8th added another victim to the growing list. As in previous cases, investigators carefully documented the condition of the residence, searched for physical evidence, and compared every observable detail with the files already accumulated over months of investigation. Although the available information suggested similarities to earlier murders, detectives remained increasingly aware that each additional case also introduced subtle variations. Those variations became impossible to ignore, even while the broader pattern appeared to continue. Less than 3 months later, on November 23rd, 23-year-old Joan Graff became another victim connected to the investigation. Her age again highlighted the expanding range among those believed to have been targeted. Earlier victims had largely been older women living alone. Yet younger women had increasingly appeared within the series, beginning with Sophie Clark and Patricia Bissett. Investigators struggled to determine whether this represented an evolution in offender behavior or evidence that more than one individual was responsible. The question could not be answered with the forensic capabilities available at the time. Instead, Detectives continued documenting similarities while acknowledging differences that resisted simple explanation. Only 4 days after Joan Graff's death, another tragedy followed. On November 27th, 85-year-old Bessie Goldberg was found dead, becoming the oldest woman linked to the Boston Strangler investigation. Her murder dramatically illustrated the extraordinary range of victim ages now associated with the case. From 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, whose story had yet to unfold, to Bessie Goldberg at 85, investigators faced a victim profile spanning more than 6 decades of life. Such diversity challenged traditional assumptions about offender preferences. Many criminal investigations rely upon identifying common characteristics among victims in hopes of understanding why specific individuals were selected. Here, however, the range itself became part of the mystery. The women differed significantly in age, yet many had one important characteristic in common. They lived alone, and investigators continued finding little evidence that doors had been forced open. This recurring observation remained central to police thinking. Detectives believed that the offender, whoever he might be, likely gained access through persuasion rather than violence directed at the entrance itself. The ability to appear trustworthy continued to occupy an important place in investigative theory. Throughout these months, Boston remained a city deeply affected by uncertainty. Residents increasingly understood that the investigation had not produced a clear suspect despite months of intensive police work. Public anxiety remained high, fueled by newspaper coverage and the realization that the murders continued despite expanding investigative efforts. Families encouraged relatives living alone to adopt additional precautions. Apartment residents became more selective about answering unexpected knocks. Ordinary interactions that once seemed harmless now prompted hesitation. Every unfamiliar visitor could represent nothing more than a legitimate service worker, or something far more dangerous. Investigators shared many of these concerns, though from a different perspective. They understood that each passing week without an arrest created opportunities for additional violence. The investigation had already involved hundreds of officers, more than 8,000 interviews, and the collection of thousands of fingerprints. Yet no decisive breakthrough had emerged. Without DNA analysis or modern surveillance technology, detectives remained dependent upon traditional investigative methods that demanded time, patience, and considerable judgment. Every witness statement required careful evaluation. Every physical clue had to be interpreted within the broader context of an investigation that had grown increasingly complicated. Then, on January 4th, 1964, the final murder commonly associated with the Boston Strangler occurred. 19-year-old Mary Sullivan had recently moved to Boston and was working as a secretary. Like several younger victims before her, she represented another departure from the earliest assumptions investigators had formed during the summer of 1962. When friends became concerned after failing to contact her, they went to her apartment. The door was unlocked. Inside, they encountered a scene that immediately demanded police attention. Mary Sullivan was found lying on her bed. A scarf had been tied around her neck, and investigators observed indications that the scene itself had been deliberately arranged after the killing. Her clothing had been disturbed, and the positioning within the room suggested that the offender had remained inside longer than might normally be expected following such a crime. This observation distinguished Mary's case from many assumptions surrounding earlier murders. Detectives believed the individual responsible may not have fled immediately after the attack, but instead spent additional time inside the apartment. Such behavior implied an unusual degree of confidence or composure, further complicating efforts to understand the offender's psychology. Yet investigators remained careful not to draw conclusions unsupported by evidence. The crime scene provided important observations, but those observations alone could not reveal identity. Mary's murder would later become one of the most significant cases within the entire investigation. Not only because it marked the final killing commonly attributed to the Boston Strangler, but also because it would decades later become the focus of modern forensic testing unavailable to investigators in 1964. At the time, however, detectives possessed only the investigative tools of their era. They photographed the scene, collected available evidence, interviewed witnesses, and compared every observable detail with previous cases. The investigation continued following the same painstaking methods that had characterized every stage of the inquiry. Yet despite the enormous amount of work invested, certainty remained elusive. Looking across the complete list of 13 women associated with the Boston Strangler investigation, detectives recognized both striking consistencies and equally significant inconsistencies. Many victims had apparently opened their own doors. Strangulation appeared repeatedly as the method of killing, often involving readily available items such as clothing, towels, scarves, or nylon stockings. Some crime scenes suggested sexual assault, while others did not. Certain scenes appeared carefully arranged, whereas others differed noticeably in their presentation. One victim had suffered multiple stab wounds before being strangled. Ages ranged from 19 to 85. These contrasts became increasingly difficult to reconcile within a single behavioral profile. Nevertheless, investigators could not dismiss the repeated similarities that continued linking the cases. Consequently, the Boston Strangler investigation entered a new phase. The murders had apparently ceased, but the search for the individual responsible intensified rather than diminished. Detectives reviewed evidence collected over nearly 2 years, hoping that a connection previously overlooked might finally emerge. Public pressure remained considerable. Families sought answers. Residents wanted reassurance that the danger had truly ended rather than merely paused. Police understood that solving the case required more than identifying a suspect. It required evidence capable of withstanding careful scrutiny. That evidence had not yet appeared. Unknown to investigators at the time, the next major development would not arise from another crime scene, but from a man already known to law enforcement for entirely different offenses. His name was Albert DeSalvo. His eventual confession would astonish investigators, raise as many questions as it answered, and ignite a debate that would continue for generations. Whether he had truly been the Boston Strangler, only one of several killers, or something else entirely, would become one of the most enduring controversies in American criminal history. By the time the murders associated with the Boston Strangler had apparently come to an end, investigators possessed an enormous collection of reports, witness interviews, fingerprint records, and crime scene documentation, yet they remained without a definitive answer. The investigation had become one of the largest criminal inquiries in the United States at that time, involving hundreds of investigators and the questioning of more than 8,000 individuals. Detectives had carefully compared the similarities among 13 murders while also confronting differences that complicated every theory they attempted to build. Public attention remained intense, and pressure to identify the person responsible had not diminished simply because the killings had stopped. Instead, every unanswered question seemed to become more significant with time. It was against this background that Albert DeSalvo entered the investigation. DeSalvo was already known to law enforcement, but not because he had been arrested for the Boston Strangler murders. Instead, he had been taken into custody for a series of unrelated sexual offenses. Among those crimes was a pattern of entering women's homes by pretending to have a legitimate reason for being there. He became known by the nickname the Measuring Man because he reportedly posed as someone conducting measurements or surveys in order to gain access to victims' residences. To investigators examining the Boston Strangler murders, this detail immediately attracted attention. Throughout the homicide investigation, one of the most persistent theories had been that many victims voluntarily opened their doors because the offender appeared trustworthy or presented a believable explanation for visiting. Although this similarity did not prove that DeSalvo was responsible for the murders, it established a point of interest that detectives could not ignore. While undergoing treatment at a psychiatric hospital, DeSalvo made an extraordinary claim. He confessed that he was the Boston Strangler. According to the information provided during questioning, he described numerous aspects of the murders and explained how he had approached victims, entered their homes, and carried out the attacks. The confession immediately transformed the investigation. For detectives who had spent years attempting to identify an unknown offender, the possibility that someone had voluntarily admitted responsibility for the crimes represented a dramatic turning point. Even more remarkable was the fact that DeSalvo reportedly described details from several crime scenes that had not been widely released to the public. Investigators found this deeply significant because knowledge of non-public information can sometimes indicate direct involvement in a crime. If DeSalvo truly possessed details unavailable through newspapers or public discussion, his confession carried substantial weight. Detectives carefully compared his statements against the evidence collected from each homicide. Certain descriptions appeared to correspond with investigative records, reinforcing the possibility that his confession reflected first-hand knowledge rather than speculation. Yet as investigators continued reviewing his statements, the situation became far more complicated than a straightforward admission of guilt. Alongside details that appeared accurate were other statements that raised serious concerns. Some aspects of DeSalvo's account did not match the evidence documented at particular crime scenes. Certain descriptions conflicted with known investigative findings, while other elements appeared inconsistent with the physical evidence available. These inaccuracies forced detectives to ask an uncomfortable question. If DeSalvo had truly committed every murder, why did portions of his confession fail to align with the established facts? Several explanations were considered. One possibility was that his memory had become imperfect over time, particularly if he had committed numerous crimes across an extended period. Another possibility was that he had acquired information indirectly through newspaper reports, conversations, or other sources and unintentionally blended factual details with inaccurate assumptions. The available evidence could not definitively resolve these possibilities. Consequently, investigators faced a confession that was both compelling and problematic at the same time. Additional concerns emerged when experts considered the broader characteristics of the murders themselves. As detectives had already recognized during the active investigation, the 13 cases were not identical. Victim ages ranged from 19 to 85. Some victims showed evidence consistent with sexual assault, while others did not. Certain crime scenes appeared carefully arranged after the killing, whereas others differed noticeably. Beverly Simon's murder remained particularly controversial because she had suffered multiple stab wounds before being strangled, a level of violence not consistently observed elsewhere in the series. These differences led some specialists to question whether one individual could reasonably be expected to account for every variation. Others argued that offenders can change their behavior over time and that differences between crimes do not automatically exclude a single perpetrator. The debate remained unresolved because the available evidence supported neither position. Conclusively, psychological evaluation also became part of the discussion surrounding DeSalvo's confession. According to the information available, some specialists believed aspects of his psychological profile did not entirely correspond with what they expected from the offender responsible for all 13 murders. Such assessments, however, could not establish innocence or guilt. Criminal behavior varies widely, and psychological analysis alone cannot replace physical evidence. Nevertheless, These observations contributed to growing uncertainty surrounding the confession. Another important limitation confronted investigators from the beginning. Despite DeSalvo's admission, there was no forensic evidence at the time capable of definitively linking him to all of the murders. Modern DNA testing had not yet been developed, leaving detectives without the scientific tools that later generations would rely upon to confirm or exclude suspects. Fingerprints and traditional forensic methods had not produced conclusive results across the entire series. As a consequence, DeSalvo's confession became one important piece of evidence rather than a complete solution to the investigation. This distinction would have lasting legal consequences. Although DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler, he was never brought to trial for the murders associated with that name. Instead, he was prosecuted and convicted for the sexual assaults and related offenses for which authorities already possess sufficient evidence. This fact remains one of the defining characteristics of the Boston Strangler case. Public discussion often assumes that DeSalvo was convicted of the murders themselves. But according to the historical record provided, that did not occur. His legal responsibility centered on the crimes for which prosecutors believed they could successfully secure convictions, not on the homicide investigation that continued to generate uncertainty. For many members of the public, the confession nevertheless appeared convincing. The idea that investigators had finally identified the notorious Boston Strangler offered a sense of resolution after years of fear and unanswered questions. Yet within investigative and academic circles, doubts persisted. Detectives understood that confessions, while powerful, must be carefully examined alongside independent evidence. A confession containing both accurate and inaccurate information requires particularly cautious evaluation because its reliability cannot simply be assumed. As years passed, those uncertainties did not disappear. Instead, they became central to the historical legacy of the case. Some researchers accepted DeSalvo's confession as essentially truthful despite its inconsistencies. Others believed he may have been responsible for only a portion of the murders. Still others questioned whether the label Boston Strangler had combined multiple offenders into one narrative long before DeSalvo entered the investigation. Because definitive forensic evidence remained unavailable for most of the murders, none of these competing interpretations could be conclusively proven during his lifetime. In 1973, while serving his prison sentence at MCI Walpole, Albert DeSalvo was fatally stabbed by another inmate. His death added another unresolved chapter to an already complicated story. According to the information available, the circumstances surrounding his killing were never fully explained. Whatever answers DeSalvo might have continued to provide regarding the murders ended with his death. For decades afterward, investigators, historians, and criminologists continued examining the Boston Strangler case without reaching universal agreement. Then, many years later, advances in forensic science would provide investigators with an opportunity unavailable to the detectives of the 1960s. Through DNA analysis, one part of the mystery would finally become much clearer. At the same time, however, the broader question that had haunted the investigation from the beginning, whether one man had truly killed all 13 women, would remain remarkably difficult to answer. For decades after Albert DeSalvo's death, the Boston Strangler case remained suspended between confession and uncertainty. To many people, DeSalvo's admission that he was responsible for the murders seemed like the final answer to a mystery that had frightened an entire city. The public had watched investigators search for years, had followed reports of fear spreading throughout Boston, and had waited for the identity of the person responsible to finally be revealed. DeSalvo's confession appeared to provide that resolution. Yet for investigators, historians, and criminal experts who examined the case more closely, important questions remained unanswered. A confession alone could not erase the inconsistencies within the investigation. The 13 murders associated with the Boston Strangler were connected by certain disturbing similarities, but they were also separated by significant differences. Without additional physical evidence, the question remained open. Was Albert DeSalvo responsible for every murder, or only some of them? The answer would remain uncertain for many years until advances in forensic science created an opportunity that investigators in the 1960s never had. In the early years of the investigation, detectives had worked with the technology available to them. They collected fingerprints, examined crime scenes, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed physical evidence according to the standards of the time. However, biological evidence could not be analyzed in the way modern investigators would later expect. DNA testing, which would eventually transform criminal investigations around the world, was not available. Evidence that might one day reveal a suspect's identity remained silent because science had not yet developed the ability to interpret it. As decades passed, however, preserved evidence from old investigations became increasingly valuable. The development of modern DNA technology allowed investigators to return to historical cases and examine evidence that had previously provided limited information. The Boston Strangler investigation became one of those cases. Researchers and investigators revisited the evidence connected to Mary Sullivan, the 19-year-old woman whose death on January 4, 1964, was the final murder commonly associated with the Boston Strangler series. Mary's case had always held particular importance. It was the last known killing in the series, and investigators had documented unusual details at the crime scene. The possibility that modern forensic methods could finally provide answers made her case the focus of renewed attention. In 2013, investigators used advanced DNA technology to examine preserved evidence connected to Mary Sullivan's murder. The goal was straightforward: determine whether biological material from the crime scene could be compared with Albert DeSalvo. To conduct the analysis, investigators used DNA obtained from DeSalvo after his death and compared it with evidence collected from the Sullivan crime scene. The result represented a major development in the decades-long investigation. The DNA evidence matched Albert DeSalvo, strongly supporting the conclusion that he was responsible for Mary Sullivan's murder. For the first time, modern forensic science provided direct physical evidence connecting DeSalvo to one of the Boston Strangler cases. This discovery significantly strengthened the argument that DeSalvo's confession had contained genuine information rather than being entirely fabricated. After years of debate, investigators had scientific evidence linking him to at least one murder associated with the Boston Strangler investigation. However, the discovery did not solve the entire mystery. The DNA evidence confirmed a connection to Mary Sullivan, but it did not prove that DeSalvo committed all 13 murders. This distinction remained crucial. The Boston Strangler investigation involved 13 women, but DNA evidence was not available for every case. Many of the original crime scenes had occurred decades earlier, and much of the physical evidence was either unavailable, degraded, or insufficient for modern testing. As a result, investigators could not apply the same scientific confirmation to the remaining murders. The discovery answered one important question while leaving the larger mystery intact. DeSalvo had been linked to Mary Sullivan, but whether he had killed Anna Sleezers, Nina Nichols, Helen Blake, Ida Erga, Jane Sullivan, Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, Mary Brown, Beverly Simons, Evelyn Corbin, Joan Graff, and Bessie Goldberg remained uncertain. This limitation explains why the Boston Strangler case continues to generate debate. The modern DNA evidence changed the discussion, but it did not eliminate every possibility. Some researchers argued that the connection to Mary Sullivan supported DeSalvo's broader confession. If he had accurately described one murder they believed, his claims regarding other victims deserved serious consideration. They pointed to the fact that he had provided details about crime scenes that investigators believed were not widely known. To them, these details suggested that DeSalvo possessed direct knowledge of multiple murders. However, other investigators and historians remain cautious. They emphasize that accurate information about one crime does not automatically prove responsibility for every similar crime committed during the same period. The differences among the 13 murders continued to raise concerns. The victims were separated by enormous differences in age. The circumstances of the killings were not identical. Some cases involved evidence of sexual assault, while others did not. Some crime scenes appeared staged, while others showed different characteristics. Beverly Salmon's murder remained especially important in this debate because of the use of a knife and the multiple stab wounds before strangulation. These variations suggested to some experts that the Boston Strangler label may have represented more than one offender. The possibility that multiple killers were active during the same period became an important alternative explanation. According to this theory, investigators and the media may have connected separate crimes because they shared certain characteristics, especially the strangulation method and the fact that many victims lived alone. The name Boston Strangler may therefore have described a collection of crimes rather than the actions of a single individual. This possibility did not mean that DeSalvo was unrelated to the investigation. Instead, it suggested that his role may have been more limited than originally believed. Under this interpretation, DeSalvo could have been responsible for Mary Sullivan and possibly other murders, while additional victims may have been killed by someone else. The debate illustrates the difference between suspicion, probability, and proof. Criminal investigations often rely upon patterns and theories, but final conclusions require evidence strong enough to withstand examination. In the Boston Strangler case, modern science provided a significant piece of that evidence, but only for one victim. The remaining cases continued to exist in a space between possibility and certainty. The impact of the DNA discovery extended beyond the question of DeSalvo's guilt. It also demonstrated how technological progress can transform historical investigations. Cases once considered impossible to resolve may later reveal information through methods unavailable to earlier generations. The Boston Strangler investigation became an example of both the power and the limitations of forensic science. DNA could establish a connection that had remained uncertain for decades, but it could not answer questions when evidence was no longer available. Even with advanced technology, investigators were still limited by the physical materials that survived. The 2013 findings, therefore, represented both a breakthrough and a reminder of the challenges that remained. Albert DeSalvo was no longer simply a man who confessed without physical confirmation. Modern science had connected him to Mary Sullivan's murder. Yet the larger identity of the Boston Strangler remained unresolved. The name continued to represent a mystery involving 13 women whose deaths changed Boston forever. Their cases became part of American criminal history, not only because of the violence involved, but because of the questions that remained after decades of investigation. The evidence had evolved, the technology had advanced, and one piece of the puzzle had finally been revealed. But the complete picture remained incomplete. The Boston Strangler case continued to stand as a reminder that even the most determined investigations do not always produce absolute answers. Sometimes history provides fragments rather than certainty, a confession, a DNA match, a collection of similarities, and a series of unresolved questions. For the families of the victims and for those who continued studying the case, the search for truth was never only about identifying a name. It was also about remembering the women whose lives were taken and understanding the circumstances that allowed such crimes to occur. The investigation had begun with 13 victims in a city searching for safety. Decades later, it remained a story defined by both discovery and uncertainty. The passage of time has transformed the Boston Strangler case from an active criminal investigation into one of the most debated and examined mysteries in American crime history. More than 6 decades have passed since the final murder associated with the case. Yet the central questions surrounding the identity of the offender remain unresolved. The investigation produced a confession, a conviction for related crimes, and later a significant DNA discovery. But it never produced complete certainty regarding all 13 deaths. This unusual combination of evidence and unanswered questions has ensured that the Boston Strangler remains a subject of discussion among investigators, historians, and criminal experts. The case is remembered not only because of the violence committed against 13 women, but also because of the uncertainty that surrounded the search for justice. From the beginning, investigators faced a difficult challenge. They had to determine whether a single offender was responsible for a series of murders or whether several unrelated crimes had been combined under one terrifying name. The similarities were undeniable. Many victims lived alone. Many were apparently attacked after allowing the offender into their homes. Strangulation appeared repeatedly, often involving materials available within the residence, such as clothing, scarves, or nylon stockings. In several cases, investigators believe the offender had arranged aspects of the scene after the killings. These common characteristics created the image of one individual moving through Boston and surrounding communities with a consistent method. However, beneath these similarities existed differences that continued to challenge the theory of a single killer. The victims represented a remarkably wide range of ages. Some were elderly women living alone, while others were young women in their 20s. Some crime scenes included indications of sexual assault, while others did not. Some victims appeared to have been killed using similar methods, while others showed significant differences in the violence used against them. These inconsistencies became increasingly important as researchers examined the case over time. A central question emerged: if one person committed all 13 murders, why did the crimes vary so significantly? Supporters of the theory that DeSalvo was responsible for the entire series argued that criminal behavior can change. They suggested that an offender may alter methods, target different victims, or leave different patterns depending on circumstances surrounding each crime. From this perspective, the similarities among the cases carried greater significance than the differences. They pointed to DeSalvo's confession, his knowledge of details connected to the murders, and the DNA evidence linking him to Mary Sullivan as important pieces supporting his involvement. The confession remained particularly significant because DeSalvo had described aspects of the crimes that investigators believed were not publicly available. For those who accepted his claims, these details suggested first-hand knowledge that would be difficult to explain if he had no involvement. However, critics of the single killer theory continued emphasizing the weaknesses surrounding the confession. They noted that DeSalvo was never tried or convicted for the Boston Strangler murders themselves. His criminal conviction involved the sexual assaults and related offenses for which authorities had sufficient evidence. While his confession attracted enormous attention, legal standards require proof beyond an admission of guilt, especially in cases involving multiple victims and decades-old evidence. Critics argued that the confession contained inaccuracies and that some details did not correspond with known crime scene information. To them, the possibility remained that DeSalvo exaggerated his role or claimed responsibility for crimes he did not commit. The question became even more complicated after considering the possibility of multiple offenders. Under this theory, The term Boston Strangler may have represented a label created to connect crimes that shared certain characteristics but were not necessarily committed by the same person. The similarities may have reflected circumstances common among several crimes rather than evidence of one individual's actions. Boston during the early 1960s contained conditions that investigators believed could have contributed to this confusion. Many women lived alone. Apartment buildings allowed unfamiliar individuals to move through shared spaces. People often trusted those who appeared to have legitimate reasons for visiting. A criminal who understood these social habits could potentially exploit them, meaning more than one offender could have used similar methods during the same period. This possibility has remained one of the most important alternative explanations for the case. The debate over the Boston Strangler also influenced the development of criminal investigation methods in the United States. The enormous effort required to investigate the murders demonstrated the importance of cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Systematic record-keeping and careful analysis of patterns across multiple crimes. Although investigators in the 1960s lacked modern forensic technology, their work established approaches that would later become more advanced. The case became part of a broader shift toward understanding serial offenders, studying behavioral patterns, and developing methods for connecting crimes across different locations. The later use of DNA technology demonstrated how dramatically criminal investigations could change. Over time, the discovery linking DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan showed the value of preserving evidence and revisiting historical cases with new scientific tools. Evidence that once seemed limited could later provide powerful information. However, the case also demonstrated the limitations of technology. DNA could only answer questions when suitable evidence remained available. It could confirm a connection in one case, but could not reconstruct every event that occurred. Decades earlier, the women at the center of the investigation remained the most important part of the story. Their identities should not be reduced only to their connection with an infamous criminal case. Each victim was an individual whose life existed beyond the circumstances of her death. Anna Slesers, Nina Nichols, Helen Blake, Ita Irka, Janne Sullivan, Sophie Clark, Patricia Pisette. Mary Brown, Beverly Simons, Evelyn Corbin, Joan Graff, Bessie Goldberg, and Mary Sullivan represented 13 separate lives interrupted by violence. The investigation that followed focused heavily on identifying a perpetrator. But the human cost of the crimes remained with families, friends, and communities long after the headlines disappeared. The fear created by the murders also left a lasting impact on Boston. The case changed how many residents viewed personal safety and interactions with strangers. A city where people had traditionally trusted familiar routines became more cautious. The simple act of answering a door became associated with uncertainty. The murders demonstrated how quickly public confidence can be damaged when a threat remains invisible and unidentified, even after DeSalvo became the central figure associated with the case. Questions about the complete truth continued. His death in prison in 1973 ended the possibility of further questioning him directly. The circumstances surrounding his killing remained unresolved, leaving investigators and historians without the opportunity to compare future evidence against additional statements from DeSalvo himself. As a result, the case entered history with a rare combination of known facts and permanent uncertainty. Today, the Boston Strangler investigation remains a powerful example of the complexity of criminal cases. It shows that solving one part of mystery does not always solve the entire mystery. Albert DeSalvo was linked through DNA to the murder of Mary Sullivan, providing important evidence that he was involved in at least one Boston Strangler case. Yet the question of whether he was responsible for all 13 murders remains unanswered. The evidence supports different interpretations, and the lack of complete forensic confirmation prevents a final conclusion. Ultimately, the legacy of the Boston Strangler is not only the story of suspect or an investigation. It is the story of 13 women whose deaths changed a city and challenged the limits of criminal justice. It is a reminder that investigations are built from evidence, but evidence is sometimes incomplete. It is a reminder that public fear can shape perceptions, and that historical narratives can become complicated when certainty is impossible. More than 60 years later, the case continues to be studied because it represents one of the most difficult questions in criminal investigation. How do we determine the truth when some answers are permanently beyond reach? The search for understanding continues, not because the victims have been forgotten, but because their stories remain a reminder of the importance of seeking justice even when the path toward the truth is incomplete. The story of the Boston Strangler is not only a record of 13 deaths, a long investigation, and a disputed confession. It is also a story about the limits of certainty, the difficulties faced by investigators, and a lasting impact that unresolved questions can leave on society. More than 60 years after the final murder connected to the case, the name Boston Strangler continues to represent one of the most complex criminal investigations in American history. It remains a case where important questions were answered, yet the largest question of all has never been completely resolved. Was there truly one Boston Strangler? Or did the name become attached to multiple crimes committed by different individuals? The answer remains uncertain. However, the search for that answer has shaped the way generations understand criminal investigation, forensic science, and the pursuit of justice. When the first victim, Anna Sleezers, was discovered on June 14, 1962, no one could have predicted the scale of what would follow. At that moment, investigators were examining a single homicide. They were attempting to understand the circumstances surrounding the death of a 55-year-old woman who had lived quietly and independently. Her death was a tragedy for her family and community, but it was not yet recognized as part of a larger pattern. Only after additional women were found dead under similar circumstances did investigators begin to understand that they might be facing something far more complicated than an isolated crime. The murders that followed changed Boston permanently. The city experienced a level of fear that extended far beyond the individual crime scenes. The idea that a stranger could enter a person's home, a place normally associated with safety and privacy, created a sense of vulnerability throughout the community. Women living alone became especially concerned because many of the victims shared that circumstance. The absence of forced entry made the threat even more disturbing. The offender did not appear to rely on breaking through doors or windows. Instead, investigators believe that trust, deception, or a believable explanation may have allowed the attacker to gain access. This possibility transformed ordinary interactions into potential moments of danger. A knock at the door was no longer simply a routine event. It became a reminder that appearances could be misleading. The investigation itself represented one of the largest efforts undertaken by law enforcement during that period. Hundreds of investigators participated. Thousands of interviews were conducted. Fingerprints and available physical evidence were carefully examined. Detectives attempted to compare every crime scene, searching for consistent details that could reveal the identity of the offender. They studied victim backgrounds, reviewed possible suspects, and examined every available lead. Yet despite this enormous effort, the investigation encountered obstacles that could not easily be overcome. The technology available in the early 1960s limited what investigators could prove. Without DNA analysis, biological evidence could not provide the answers that modern investigators might expect. Without advanced surveillance systems, there were no digital records showing who entered buildings or moved through neighborhoods. Investigators had to depend upon traditional methods, relying on interviews, observation, and careful comparison of evidence. Their work was extensive, but the tools available to them were limited. The emergence of Albert DeSalvo as the person who claimed responsibility for the murders changed the direction of the case. His confession appeared to provide the resolution that Boston had been waiting for. Here was a man already connected to crimes involving attacks on women and deception used to gain access to residences. His description of certain details from the murders attracted significant attention, especially because some information appeared to match details known only to investigators. For many people, DeSalvo became the answer to the mystery. However, the investigation never reached complete certainty. The concerns surrounding his confession remained significant. Some details were inconsistent with known evidence. Some aspects of his statements did not match the characteristics of particular murders. Experts also questioned whether the differences among the 13 cases were compatible with the actions of one offender. These concerns did not necessarily prove that DeSalvo was innocent of all the murders, but they demonstrated that the evidence was more complicated than a simple confession might suggest. The later DNA discovery involving Mary Sullivan represented a major moment in the history of the case. Decades after the murders, modern forensic technology provided evidence connecting Albert DeSalvo to her death. This discovery strengthened the argument that DeSalvo had been involved in at least one Boston Strangler murder. It also showed how scientific progress could revisit historical investigations and reveal information unavailable to previous generations. Yet even this breakthrough had limitations. The DNA evidence did not establish that DeSalvo committed all 13 murders. It confirmed one connection, not an entire series. That distinction remains essential when examining the case. A single confirmed murder cannot automatically prove responsibility for every similar crime. The debate surrounding the Boston Strangler demonstrates the difference between possibility and proof. It is possible that DeSalvo committed every murder. His confession, his knowledge of certain details, and the DNA evidence connected to Mary Sullivan all support that possibility. It is also possible that he committed only some of the crimes. The differences among the victims and crime scenes support the argument that multiple offenders may have been responsible. Another possibility is that the term Boston Strangler itself created an artificial connection between separate crimes that occurred during the same period. Without additional evidence, none of these explanations can be proven completely. The uncertainty surrounding the case does not diminish the importance of the investigation. Instead, it highlights the challenges faced by law enforcement when evidence is incomplete. Criminal investigations do not always produce perfect answers. Sometimes investigators must work with fragments, partial witness accounts, incomplete physical evidence, and patterns that suggest possibilities without providing absolute conclusions. The Boston Strangler case represents one of the clearest examples of this reality. The investigation also influenced how future crimes would be examined. The scale of the inquiry demonstrated the importance of cooperation between investigators and the value of carefully organizing information from multiple crime scenes. It contributed to a greater understanding of serial offenders and the importance of identifying behavioral patterns. Later developments in forensic science, especially DNA analysis, changed criminal investigations worldwide, allowing evidence that once seemed meaningless to become powerful proof. Yet the case also serves as a reminder that technology cannot recover what has been lost. Evidence must survive. Records must remain available. The passage of time can permanently remove answers that investigators need. Above all, the Boston Strangler case belongs to the victims. The names connected to the investigation represent real people whose lives were far more than the circumstances of their deaths. Anna Slesers, Nina Nichols, Helen Blake, Ita Irka, Janne Sullivan, Sophie Clark, Patricia Pisette, Mary Brown, Beverly Simons, Evelyn Corbin, Joan Graff, Bessie Goldberg, and Mary Sullivan were individuals with families, memories, and personal histories. Their stories became linked to one of America's most famous criminal investigations. But their identities should not be defined only by the crimes committed against them. Remembering the victims remains the most important part of understanding the case. The Boston Strangler investigation ended without the complete certainty that many hoped to achieve. Albert DeSalvo remains permanently connected to the case through his confession and the DNA evidence, linking him to Mary Sullivan's murder. However, whether he was responsible for every death associated with the Boston Strangler remains a question without a final answer. That uncertainty is what continues to make the case significant. It is a reminder that justice is not always a simple conclusion. Sometimes it is a continuing search for truth based on the evidence that remains. More than 6 decades later, the Boston Strangler case still challenges investigators, historians, and the public to examine how we understand guilt, evidence, and memory. It remains a story of fear, investigation, scientific progress, and unanswered questions. But most importantly, it remains a story of 13 women whose lives were taken and whose memory continues to shape the pursuit of justice. Their names are the foundation of the case, and their stories are the reason the search for truth continues. The final chapter of the Boston Strangler case is not defined by a dramatic courtroom conclusion or a single moment when every mystery was solved. Instead, it is defined by the lasting questions that remained after the investigation had already changed American criminal history. The case began with a series of terrifying discoveries in Boston and surrounding communities, grew into one of the largest homicide investigations of its time, and eventually became a symbol of both the possibilities and limitations of criminal justice. Even after Albert DeSalvo became the central figure associated with the murders, uncertainty continued to surround the full truth of what happened between 1962 and 1964. The story of the Boston Strangler is therefore not simply the story of a suspected offender. It is the story of an investigation that struggled to separate fact from assumption, a city that lived through fear, and 13 women whose lives became permanently connected to one of the most debated cases in American history. Looking back at the timeline of events, investigators were confronted with a series of crimes that appeared connected but never completely identical. The early murders of Anna Slesers, Nina Nichols, and Helen Blake created the foundation of the investigation. Each woman was found dead inside her own residence, and each case contained similarities that immediately attracted police attention. The absence of obvious forced entry suggested that the offender may have gained access without using physical force. This pattern continued through several later cases and became one of the most important elements in the investigation. Detectives believed the person responsible understood how to appear trustworthy or create a situation where victims would allow him inside. That possibility was deeply disturbing because it meant the danger was hidden behind ordinary interactions. The investigation continued as more women were killed, and every new victim brought both additional evidence and additional uncertainty. Ida Erga, Jane Sullivan, Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, and Mary Brown became part of a growing list of victims whose deaths forced investigators to examine whether they were facing one offender or multiple offenders. The murders shared important characteristics, especially the repeated use of strangulation and the vulnerability of women living alone. However, the differences between cases became increasingly difficult to ignore. The ages of the victims varied dramatically. Some cases involved indications of sexual assault, while others did not. Some crime scenes appeared arranged after the killings, while others contained different characteristics. These differences would later become central to the debate over whether the Boston Strangler was truly one person. The murders of Beverly Summons, Evelyn Corbin, Joan Graff, and Bessie Goldberg added further complexity. Beverly Summons' death especially raised questions because of the presence of multiple stab wounds before strangulation. For investigators and later researchers, this difference represented an important challenge to the theory of a single offender. If one person committed every murder, they needed to explain why the methods and circumstances changed. While criminal behavior can evolve, significant variations require careful analysis. The possibility that separate offenders were responsible became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Yet at the time, investigators faced the reality of an active criminal investigation. They could not wait for perfect answers. They had to work with the evidence available and attempt to prevent further violence. When Mary Sullivan was murdered on January 4, 1964, the case entered another important stage. Her death became the final murder commonly associated with the Boston Strangler investigation and later became the focus of the most significant forensic development in the case. At the time, however, detectives had no way of knowing that evidence from Mary's apartment would decades later provide a major connection to Albert DeSalvo. They investigated her death using the same methods available throughout the 1960s, carefully documenting the scene, collecting evidence, and comparing the circumstances with previous murders. The investigation eventually led to Albert DeSalvo, whose confession created the possibility that the mystery had finally been solved. His background made him a compelling suspect. He had committed crimes involving deception and attacks against women, and his method of gaining access to victims appeared similar to theories developed during the homicide investigation. When he claimed to be the Boston Strangler, many people believed the case had reached its conclusion. However, the truth proved far more complicated. DeSalvo's confession contained both convincing details and troubling inconsistencies. Some information appeared to demonstrate knowledge of the crimes, while other statements failed to match known evidence. The fact that he was never tried for the murders themselves also remained important. He was convicted for other crimes, but the legal system never established his responsibility for the entire Boston Strangler series through a criminal trial. This distinction separated public belief from legal proof. Decades later, DNA technology changed the discussion. The 2013 testing connected Albert DeSalvo to the murder of Mary Sullivan, providing physical evidence that had not existed during the original investigation. This discovery strengthened the conclusion that DeSalvo was involved in at least one of the Boston Strangler murders. It represented a significant achievement for modern forensic science and demonstrated how evidence from historical cases can reveal new information. However, it did not provide a complete answer. The DNA evidence did not confirm that DeSalvo was responsible for all 13 murders. Without comparable evidence from the remaining cases, the broader question remained unresolved. This uncertainty is why the Boston Strangler case continues to attract attention. It exists between two realities, one supported by evidence and one limited by what cannot be proven. Albert DeSalvo was not simply a random suspect. He was connected to the case through his confession and through scientific evidence related to Mary Sullivan. Yet the complete story of the 13 victims remains uncertain. The possibility that multiple offenders were responsible continues to be considered by many researchers because the differences among the crimes cannot be easily explained. The case demonstrates that investigations are often shaped not only by what evidence reveals, but also by what evidence cannot establish. The legacy of the Boston Strangler extends beyond the identity of the offender. The case influenced public awareness of personal safety, changed investigative practices, and became part of the development of modern criminal analysis. It showed the importance of cooperation between law enforcement agencies and demonstrated the value of preserving evidence for future scientific examination. At the same time, it revealed the limitations faced by investigators when technology is unable to provide definitive answers. Ultimately, the most important part of the Boston Strangler story remains the victims themselves. Behind the investigation, the theories, and the decades of debate were 13 women whose lives were taken. They were not simply names in a criminal file. They were individuals with personal histories, relationships, and futures that ended because of violence. Remembering them is essential because the true measure of an investigation is not only whether it identifies a suspect, but whether it preserves the memory and dignity of those who suffered. More than 60 years later, the Boston Strangler remains an unfinished chapter in American criminal history. Albert DeSalvo's connection to Mary Sullivan provides an important piece of the puzzle, but the complete picture has never been fully revealed. The case continues to challenge assumptions about evidence, justice, and certainty. It reminds us that some investigations do not end with absolute answers. Instead, they leave behind a responsibility to continue examining the facts, questioning what is known, and remembering the people whose lives were at the center of the search for truth.